it's always for me pleasure and to some extent a duty to talk about this. And I'm glad that I'm in touch with Italy. As you can see from my name, I have a strong family connection, actually. Unfortunately, I cannot, my Italian is at the level of Maradona. So I can only present this in English. I think Matthew gave a very good introduction of what is that we are doing, why we are doing what we are doing. But let me expand on this. And one way to think about this is that if you look at the way mental health care, at least, is practiced, it hasn't really changed for almost 100 years. And there are good reasons for that. And it's not an indictment. But if you look at it in the US, and these are numbers from the Center for Disease Controls, there are more than 63 million mental health related interviews between patients and clinicians per year, which is really a phenomenal number. Now, what is interesting is that none of those, except the handful that I will show you today, are analyzed with tools that we use on a daily basis. And for us, the motivation is help, in particular the assessment, but increasingly also the treatment, because it requires a presence, it's labor intensive, it's unreliable oftentimes, and at the same time it requires confidentiality and privacy, and these are topics that we can address with current computer technology and artificial intelligence. But what is going back to the 63 million interviews, what's really incredible is that outside of the clinic, as we all know, the information technology is buzzing with activity. There are millions and billions of emails and postings and tweets. They're analyzed constantly for all sort of information that is for the most part driven by commercial interests. So my postings are analyzed to see whether I prefer Nike or Adidas or Pepsi or Coke. And what we are trying to do is address this gap between what can be done outside of the mental health clinic and what is being done inside the mental health clinic. This has changed a little bit over the course of last year because of COVID, but still the technology is used in the same way that it was used before. So conducting the same type of interaction without taking full advantage of what we can do. And what is that we can do? What is that we are doing? So as Matthew was saying, working with colleagues in hospitals, in academic institutions, we are taking speech samples and written samples from patients and analyze them with everything that is at our disposal today. So we take the sound waves and analyze basic features of frequency, prosody. We analyze automatically the syntactic structure of sentences, something that we know from school, but we can do that automatically. We do the typical data-driven analysis. I use the analogy of throwing spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. But at the same time, and we spend a lot of time on that, we try to take concepts that are well established in psychiatry and neurology and create algorithms that will try to mimic what a clinician will do. Right? So a combination also of the very small, low-level features like the frequency of your voice to complex things such as whether a sentence has a metaphoric content or not. And we can address those issues with different degrees of success, but at least the point that we're trying to make is we are measuring always the same thing, right? It can be incomplete, but it's like using an electrocardiogram machine. So, the decision is in the hand of the clinician, but at least we are measuring always the same thing. So let me give you some of the examples of the things that we are doing, and I will touch on them lightly, and hopefully, if you ask me questions, I can go in more depth. So one of the things that we have done in recent years is working with patients with schizophrenia, but more importantly, patients who are at risk of developing schizophrenia. This is known as a clinical high risk population. And one of the things that we set out to do is to answer the question, can we predict who will eventually develop a first episode of schizophrenia or a psychotic episode, so that we can intervene early on, and there are strategies that have been shown to be successful in that sense. So, and the answer is that yes, we can do that with a significant degree of accuracy. And the way we do that is taking interviews, what we call baseline interviews, when these people are considered to be at risk, but they have not had an episode, and analyze them using artificial intelligence, but specifically targeting things that we know are important, right? So we know that the idea of derailment, of flight of ideas, when people go off a tangent, we can measure that specifically. We know that what's called poverty of speech is important. So these people tend to have a structure, the language is not florid, it's not structure, it doesn't have nuance. We can measure that too. And there is the idea that psychosis is related to disturbance of the self, how people think about themselves, how think about themselves in relationship to other people. And that's very complex, but we can measure some aspect of it that is reflected directly in language. And with all those features, we were able to show that it is possible to predict in advance those that are very likely to convert, right? And like I said, use that for the purpose of designing interventions. In another direction in mental health, and this is related to the use of drugs of abuse and addiction in general, we were able to show that it is possible to identify whether a person has ingested a particular psychoactive drug like ecstasy, methamphetamine, and oxytocin by looking at the way they speak, but in particular, targeting concepts that we know are related to the effect of the drug, right? So for instance, with ecstasy, we know that there is a particular modulation of the way people experience emotions. So we can measure that using AI techniques in the way they're speaking. And we combine that with something that to some extent might be simpler, but is the effect that the psychoactive drugs have an effect on your motor control, and then obviously have an effect in your voice. But also because of the modulation of your emotions, there is a change in prosody, right? In the prosody, how you accentuate and modulate the words. So we combine all of that, and we show that with just a few minutes of speech, we can identify whether the person has ingested one of these psychoactive drugs. And we are using that in studies where we try to identify people who will respond to, for instance, a withdrawal or therapy in cocaine, right? So that's one of the motivations is to use that as part of therapy. In moving on to neurodegeneration. So I talked about psychiatric conditions, work on, like I said, on drug addiction, and there is a big segment of mental health is neurodegeneration and Parkinson's in particular. So something that we have been doing is precisely using these techniques to identify if someone has Parkinson's, but also more specifically evaluate and assess them without having to rely on a neurologist present, right? Sometimes it's difficult to bring people to the clinic. Some of them have motor impairments. So we have shown that it is possible using simple techniques that actually one of them relies on something that was known in the literature. People with Parkinson tend to repeat and stumble by repeating a word or short sentences. We were able to measure that automatically and find that it's correlated with the degree of the deterioration that they have. We have done this across different languages and found things that are just in themselves interesting, that there are languages, as you may know, that pack a lot of information, even syntactic information, in the construction of the words. I mean, German is one of them. We have these very, very long German words. So we found that that complexity in the words can be used to detect Parkinson, and there is a gradation from highly morphological languages like Czech, less so German, even less so Spanish. What is interesting is that that allows us to find also how to map the things that we find in one language to another. And another example that it's really related specifically to therapy is something that we did with Pfizer that everyone knows now because of vaccine, where we used these techniques to identify if a patient has ingested the drug that is used for therapy. Is the replacement of dopamine. Is called levodopa. So we can identify whether when the patient is at home, whether the patient ingested levodopa, we can measure the effect. And when it's on levodopa, on off levodopa, with the idea that we can use that to identify the best time of the day for the patient to ingest the drug, or whether it has ingested, it has no effect, right? So that's the idea that we can do this with natural speech while the patient is at home in a very simple way, using actually just a smartphone. Along similar lines, we are now showing that we can take short video clips of a patient and identify whether that patient has Parkinson's because of the facial expressions that they use, or they don't. Actually, that's what happens, that there are many things that they expressions that they don't use, and also relate that to the degree of deterioration. And as a cute example, and we got the permission from the famous actor Alan Alda to use his interviews and show that we can time the onset of Parkinson's from the interviews exactly at the time when he was clinically diagnosed. So the value of this is that, again, we can follow a patient for treatment using, again, the smartphone, just 2 minutes clip, speaking and just in front of the camera, in order to see whether the patient is improving or is not improving, right? In a way that is really very with very little burden and invasion in their life. So, another interesting example that I think it reflects the same approach, and what is that we can do is in another neurodegenerative disorder, that is cognitive impairment or dementia, or however we want to call it. So something that we have shown recently is that we can take a very simple speech task, and you can see this on the left. You are asked to describe that picture that you see there. And that's all you have to do. And as you can see, this harks back to decades ago in the US. So it's a typical I Love Lucy kind of situation, because this is a test that's been given to people for many decades, precisely. But we can see that we can take just what people are saying, look at the structure, not even the content, just look at the structure, the syntax that they produce, and with that infer with 70% accuracy the scale of the deterioration. It's called the mini mental state. That is what is evaluated by a neurologist while in the presence of the person. It takes the whole process, between 40 minutes and 1 hour. And we can do this remotely with a smartphone when the person is at home. But based on this, we have done something that it's perhaps more relevant, and that is the possibility of predicting, technically it's called, we call outcomes. So what we have here is a phenomenal study that's been conducted in the US in a town in Massachusetts for decades, where the population of that town is followed every year with a full health assessment that includes a cognitive assessment and includes this little task of describing what's called the cookie theft picture. So what we did was to ask ourselves the question, is it possible to take the speech sample from a person that the neurologist considered to be healthy cognitively and predict whether they will develop Alzheimer's by the age of 85? So will you develop Alzheimer's before 85 or after, or perhaps never, right? And so again, applying our artificial intelligence techniques and trying to capture things that were known in the literature, like, for instance, the fact that people with impairment tend to provide non-specific nouns, right? Say person as opposed to woman, or maybe mother, or young housewife, etc. Repeating things over and over again, and some other very, very subtle features. We put that together, and we're able to show that we can predict that with a probability of close to 75%. Whereas if you flip a coin, it's 50%. And if you take all the clinical information available at the moment, you get only 60%. Right? So, the importance of this is that, again, with something very, very simple that we can do every day, not every day, but every week, every month, we have an idea of where the patient will be at, actually, on average 7 years later. And it's not so important the fact that we can predict that, but the fact that we can use it in a therapy. Because if today I predict you that you are likely to develop Alzheimer's, and I do something, some therapy, change of lifestyle, whatever, and I see you again 6 months from now, and now I predict that you are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, then I know that my intervention is having an effect, and I don't have to wait for years, right? So that's the way we are thinking about this, and why the value of this type of predictive model for outcomes. We are also exploring something that is new that the people who initiated that study didn't have, and that is social media. So we have shown recently that using a very popular posting website, Reddit, we can extract very interesting information about how people who self-describe as being schizophrenic or having depression, etc. So it's not clinically validated, but it still is important. We can see that there is in all these groups that have concerns with mental health that at the beginning of COVID, the one self-described as health anxious immediately jump, and they're the first ones to detect that there was COVID, and then everyone else then become more and more similar to them. It's affecting the whole spectrum of mental health, but also it's interesting that some of the more resilient, resistant to treatment conditions such as schizophrenia and autism are the ones that are really not affected. So that it's for free, we are getting this for free. It's a way of extracting information that can inform clinicians and therapists and researchers in understanding the full spectrum of mental disorders. So something similar we have done with Facebook. In this case, it's a fully clinically validated study. We have patients who check in the hospital with a mental health crisis, and then before being discharged, after stabilizing, they allow us to look at their Facebook stream. So we found a treasure trove of information that allow us to go back into their digital life and identify that they were having problems all along, right? So we can go back 1 year, 1.5 years, and still determine that these people are likely to end up in the hospital, just looking at what they post, the content that they post. We look at the pictures, features of the pictures. So the pictures are blurry, they lack color. They are all pieces of information that we get essentially for free, and we can analyze, in a way very easily with our techniques, and provide eventually to the clinician as a way of monitoring the health of their patient. And just to conclude this part, let me mention that I already talked a little bit about this, but we have several studies, and this one is in particular on ALS, the Stephen Hawking's disease, in which we track specifically patients on a weekly basis. So every week, the patients do some motor task in the smartphone. They leave a speech sample, and that allows us to understand how they're progressing in the disease, a disease for which, unfortunately, there is no cure at the moment. But at least we are gathering this information to understand precisely why some people live so much longer than others, like Stephen Hawking, where the average life expectancy is 3 years. So to understand, what are those patients, and then look at the genetic profile and other information in order to define the next step in therapy. Sorry, one moment. Okay. So let me now switch gears a little bit, but it's really related, because I've been talking about artificial intelligence as if it's a panacea, and we know that there are several limitations, and one way to understand those limitations, that for me it's very personal in a way, is that artificial intelligence to a large extent is still dominated by the idea that most famously was put forward by Descartes, that there is a radical separation between the mind and the world, right? That the only thing that we can trust is what we think consciously, and everything else is in doubt. But even Descartes realized that that creates a problem. That is a problem of other minds. So if the only thing I trust is my own thinking, how do I know that someone else is conscious, for instance, or is a human? So what he said is, well, the trick is, I talk to them. So if I talk to them, I know they're human. I cannot talk to animals, so then animals are not human. Now that was put on its head by Turing, and I'm sure everyone knows Turing and the Turing test, and there is the recent movie about that, about him at least, and perhaps influenced by Wittgenstein's ideas that language is a game, that language is not private because it requires at least two people. He proposed the idea that we can understand, or we can determine that another entity is a human precisely because we talk to them. And if talking to them is natural, is normal, then the other entity is a human being, and that's it. That's the end of the story. And that has resulted in perhaps some of the most spectacular advances in artificial intelligence, despite the fact that still is, individual AI practitioners are dominated by a Cartesian perspective on things. But the most dramatic results have been shown in games, in games that, again, involve two entities. Sometimes it's an entity and a human being. And for the young audience, probably they don't know what Deep Blue is, but it was the fact that a computer program was able to defeat the world chess champion. More recently, this is something that is very popular in the US, is a Jeopardy, is a quiz game, is a quiz show, where again, the computer system was able to defeat human participants. And the most recent one is the system developed by Google that was able to defeat the world champion of Go. Right? So really paying homage to Turing, who turned the card on his head, by emphasizing the game aspect and the dialogic aspect of cognition, as opposed to the monologic Cartesian way of thinking. So inspired by that, we are trying to actually learn from psychiatry and psychology to develop better artificial intelligence models that actually can also help in the practice of mental health. And a particular example of that is work that we have been doing, trying to model therapy. So we've been working with depression therapy, so therapy between a therapist and a person who's suffering some form of depression, and trying to see if we can model that to eventually try to not replace a therapist. So we don't think that's the right way to think about it, but create a system that can help a therapist, that can help, for instance, a trainee choose better, collect and compile all the knowledge in the field in a system that is available at their fingertips. And this idea was based on the notion of modeling dialogue as a cooperation. This is one of the ideas that have shown to be successful in therapy in general. It's called the working alliance. So you and I are trying to work together for your benefit. And so we have shown very good results at predicting what the therapist will say, given what the patient said. And so that's our first step. And actually, that allows us to develop a dialogue system that is beating other AI systems, even outside of this realm. So we are, for instance, modeling the session shows of the Larry King show, right? Just how the dialogue flows there, perhaps because he was a good interviewer, sort of a collaborative interviewer. And we are moving now into understanding how that will affect therapy. So if there are patterns that are more effective than others, and again, feed that back to the therapist. And as an interesting example of the thing that we found is we have, what I'm showing you here is an actual interaction between the patient and the therapist, where the patient is complaining about the fact that therapy is very expensive, $300 an hour, etc. And the therapist is trying to assuage that, sort of going in circles. And our system says, why don't you try lithium, which is, very inexpensive way of treating patient. But of course, I mean, this is just a funny example. But this is the idea. This is where we are trying to go. Can we provide the human therapies with different alternatives based on what we have learned having modeled